have a seat.
Oh my goodness, how are you? Well, you doing good? Great, great, yes.
We're ready to start. I know we have to be convenient. Just a quick one. Again, this evening. Can I have your attention please so we can start the program? Attention. Okay, for your convenience, we're going to start with some advertising. But I hope that's not going to disturb the proceeding of the program, because eventually, after we're done with the program, we will be serving the meat. So we need your cooperation and we need your attention. So to help us move forward with tonight's program on time, so we don't delay you. First, on behalf of the American Human Rights Council, members, board, staff, volunteers, interns, we welcome you to this annual community reception and forum. As you may be aware, AHRC organized two major events a year. One is the annual gala, which is our fundraiser dinner, which many of you attend, and we thank you for being there. And we launch and organize an annual educational forum where we choose a certain challenge facing our nation, facing our society, and yet facing the world. This year, it's about human-made disasters, and human-made disasters can be so many, and the list can be so long. But tonight, it's more focused on hate, acts of hate, violence, gun violence, mass shooting, acts of terror, domestic terrorism, as well as international terrorism. Without further ado, I know that we have a few guests that they have to leave, so we are going to make some changes in the order of the program, so we accommodate. But we are to start with the national anthem, which tonight will be performed by a dear friend, Dr. Timur, who is the director of Calvary House. It's a non-profit organization that provides aid and assistance to U.S. veterans in the U.S., besides being an ambassador as well at the church. Dr. Timur and the national anthem, please rise.
Oh, see, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleam, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streamed, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
advisory board member of AHRC as well. When we talk about human-made disasters, we also are reminded by Mother Nature disasters. However, in both ways, innocent lives are taken, and innocent life pay the price. The most precious right in this life is the right to live, is the right to life. That's why hate, violence, extremism, any act of terror at home or abroad is our common enemy as people, as humans, period. Terrorism, hate, discrimination, racism recognize no religion, no borders, and no society, and no place, and no country, and no one can be immune of such rapidly growing challenge facing our nation. So I want once again to ask you to stand up in an honor and respect for all victims of hate, terror, violence, racism, name it. Thank you. This year, we elected a new board president for AHRC. It's not just a leader in the community. He's not just a physician and a doctor. He is really a true hero, a supporter of many good causes in his silent way. We are honored and proud to introduce to you tonight Dr. Saleh Muslah, the board president, and remarks on behalf of AHRC. Dr. Saleh Muslah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming over. I didn't prepare any statements so we can have the program go fast. I know some people want to go home. Thank you for taking the time. AHRC, under the leadership, the true leadership AHRC, under the true leadership of Imam, is something that I really believe in. As its name implies, it's fight for human rights without politics or any other things that divides us. Everything that has been happening and will continue to happen under the true leadership of this dedicated individual, Imam Hamad, because he does, honestly, he does all of the work, if not most of the work. I want to congratulate him. I want to thank him for the good effort that he's making. And I want to thank everybody who supports this mission. And enjoy your night, and thank you.
Now with the official welcome to you to the city of Dearborn and Detroit, our greater Detroit area. So I'll call our Mayor Raleigh, the mayor of our diverse city of Dearborn.
Thank you, Imam. And I'm going to be very brief. I've worked with Imam for about 3 decades now, so I know him well. And I have to say, what I really appreciate is what he's already spoken about. He looks at these issues in terms of how can we bring everybody together and get consensus. And that's what gets things done. That's what makes the difference. And that's why I support this organization, and I believe it is really important because it's about honest dialogue, it's about exposing each other. You have to bring out the topic, you have to acknowledge what are the challenges, but you also then have to make it comfortable for the people to come together and discover on their own what are the solutions, how can we do this and do it right. And that's what I think of our great, wonderful program here, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, when we talk about the city of Detroit, we go back long in history. We remember icons. One of those icons, as you may recall, the late Mariam Mahaffey, who was the president of the city of Detroit City Council, and her true activism and advocacy on behalf of the human rights and humanity in general. Today, we have another icon with us, and almost join us, our hero, the Detroit City Council President, Brenda Jones, our hero.
Good evening to everyone.
Good evening.
I bring you greetings on behalf of the great city of Detroit, Michigan. Although we are not in Detroit, we are very close, and we are bordering, and we are very good neighbors. So I bring you greetings from Detroit. I want to thank the American Human Rights Council for everything that they do. I want to thank you all for supporting the American Human Rights Council. And I'm getting a little twisted because I'm thinking about civil rights. And civil rights is about to come out of my mouth because every time I think about human rights, I think about civil rights that we have as well. And I think about the children that were separated from their parents and how many children are still separated from their parents and things like that that should not be happening. And I'm going to say it again, it should not be happening. And we are in a time now where we all have to come together, work together to protect each other. If it's my family this time, it might be your family the next time. And so we have to work together to protect each other. And I also think about human trafficking, and as I look at everything that's up here and everything comes to mind, and I got involved with human trafficking and started working with human trafficking and started realizing how much money there is in D.C. dealing with human trafficking that we have not touched. That we need to start asking for the money that's in D.C. to help us deal with the slavery that's going on with human trafficking to help protect our children and some adults. So I thank you all for everything you do. I thank you for the fight. I look on this side and I see stand for human rights. And I think about if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. So let's stand for human rights. Thank you again for your support for this organization. Let's continue to work with them. Let's continue to support them. And remember, an injury to one is an injury to all. God bless you. I cannot stay. I have another event in Detroit that I have to run out to. But again, let's continue to support each other and this organization. Thank you.
I know that the FBI requested to speak as Mr. Waters must leave before 7. Without further ado, Mr. Waters from the FBI National Security Unit. As you may look at the program, we made sure to have the different perspectives, government and non, related to this rapidly growing challenge facing our nation. And this is why you have the different speakers. Hopefully and kindly we ask them to stick to the given time so we don't try and move forward with the program.
It's a pleasure to be here today. The FBI is honored to have been offered the opportunity to speak to you all. The American Human Rights Council has been steadfast in the community, fighting for the dignity and rights of individuals of every race and ethnicity and everything else. It falls in line with the FBI's vision also. The mission of the FBI is to uphold the Constitution and to protect the American people, something very similar to what this organization does, so I commend you all for your efforts. The topic tonight, very weighty one, confronting human-made disasters and countering hate, the challenge of creating a culture that counters terrorism and other forms of violence. When I was told, when I was asked to speak on this topic, I kind of paused for a second because these are the issues that the U.S. government and governments throughout the world have struggled with over the last 20 years and really for all of time. So I'm honored to be here to share a couple of thoughts in terms of the FBI and how we approach this. I've been in Detroit since 2000. I started working counterterrorism shortly after 9/11. I've been to Iraq, Afghanistan, I spent a year in Pakistan as part of the my duties in the fight on terrorism. I have a generally good perspective on how things go in Michigan. I've been here 18 years, so I'm happy to speak to you tonight. From our perspective, from the FBI's perspective, the FBI remains the #1 priority for us, I think for obvious reasons. At any given day, we have well over 100 agents, task force officers, and analysts throughout the state of Michigan that are involved in the fight. We have at any given day, we have several hundred open investigations that we're working on. The challenge for us, a lot of these investigations wash out, thankfully, and they never see the light of day, and they're closed quietly, and no one knows the wiser. Those investigations that are more serious, where individuals through our investigation, we determine that they do represent a threat, it's a challenge for us. So for the FBI, and when it comes to terrorism, what are we trying to do, whether it be domestic, international, or any form of violence that we're trying to prevent? We have, and for me, when I talk to my people, this is the task that they have. They have to basically solve a crime before it's happened, and arrest somebody, or bring charges against somebody, or do something to prevent an act of violence from happening before it's happened. So how do you do that? A real challenge for us. We obviously use confidential news sources, we use undercover employees, who we run against people that we feel represent a real threat. We don't do these things lightly. It's a pretty heavy approval process to run operations like that. The reason we do so is because how are we supposed to determine if we have multiple people, and corroborating information that somebody represents a threat to commit an act of violence? How do we go about adjudicating that? How do we vet that information to determine if it's real or not? There's various investigative techniques we use, but at the end of the day, let's face it, people today are much more savvy online and how they communicate, and with encrypted communications, it's making life for law enforcement extremely difficult. So, there's a variety of tools out there. Really what it boils down to is we need the public's help, and we need your help. And this community has stepped up numerous times and assisted us in many investigations, and I thank you for it. A couple stats that I wanted to throw out. I talked to folks at our behavioral analysis unit about this specific topic before I came out, and I thought you might find some of these, some of their findings interesting. The FBI has studied this topic in depth, obviously for obvious reasons. We're trying to, for us, it's a continuous process trying to learn to get better at our trade craft. And when we look at individuals that have committed acts of violence across the spectrum, whether it be terrorism or the Las Vegas shooter, for example, There's a couple things that jump out to us when you really dig into the data about these individuals. I just wanted to share some of these with you. There's no single factor that causes people to radicalize or commit an act of mass violence. There's no single thing. It's always a multiple factors. There is no demographic profile. It does not exist for someone that's going to commit an act of mass violence. It's not out there. Bystanders are usually in a position to witness concerning behavior but often do not report their observations to law enforcement, which is obviously a real challenge. And we've seen that time and time again with acts of violence, mass acts of violence in the last couple of years. Successful violent extremists often have personal characteristics associated with achievement or stability in other areas of life. So these people sometimes really don't jump out. It's not like you walk around and say that's going to be a mass shooter in a month. A lot of these people are successful at what they do, and they kind of just blend into the population. One piece on those 4 observations I want to talk about is the bystander aspect of this, because this is what we're focused on in the FBI. How do we identify these people before they act? Bystanders are critical. What's the definition of a bystander? An individual who observes and learns about potentially concerning information about an individual. All right, so that's a bystander. It could be any one of us. The ability to detect concerning activity early improves our ability to disrupt plots and plans, and therefore obviously prevent the loss of life. For us, in the FBI, often when my folks are out talking to people or knocking on doors and trying to talk to folks, on occasion, and it's happened more frequently than I like, is we come across folks that have been advised not to talk to the FBI under no circumstances. To tell the FBI, you don't want to talk to us, go talk to my lawyer, here's a card, and basically go away. Obviously that makes our life a lot more difficult. If we have a threat, or we have information that a specific individual represents a threat, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to talk to associates, we're trying to talk to people that know this individual, we're trying to develop a picture of whether this is true or not. 98% of the cases, terrorism cases that we work in Detroit wash out, they're nothing. And none of you in this room know about them. But when people tell us that when people don't want to talk to us and they close the door on us, for us, we still have to vet the information. So what are we left with? In most situations, they're going to be cleared up with a simple interview. But in cases like that, we're forced to go back and at times use more intrusive investigative techniques to try to figure out if the threat information is valid or not. So I just throw that out there. I know there's people in this room that would probably disagree with what I just said, and believe me, that is your right. You do not have to talk to the FBI. But I would ask for your trust. We are here, like I said, the mission of the FBI is to uphold the Constitution and protect the American people. That's all we're trying to do. We try to be the honest brokers. Do we make mistakes? We sure do. But we're striving every day to get better to serve the people in this community. So thank you for your time. God bless.
I want to talk about ordinary Joe thinking when they first react to an act of hate, violence, or mass shooting. Regardless if it's true or not, accurate or not, perception or fact, but it is there in so many people's minds. Now, the reason I want to say it as is, because that's the value of such discussion, is to put everything on the table as is, without being shy of naming things as is. So when there are segments of people, regardless who, react to these incidents, these crimes against humanity, and look how, let's say, the first responders, whom we salute always, because they are the first on the line to respond to any act against our safety and security as people. But when these incidents happen, is it a coincidence or an imagination? If the criminal who commit this crime, let's say, is white, always the presumption is mental issue. If it happens to be an African American, it's a long record of criminal history. If it was Hispanic or so, look how the undocumented illegal immigrants are doing to our country. When the criminal, or the terrorist, I would say, is Arab and Muslim, automatically it's terrorism. The identity, the race, the faith of the individual is totally irrelevant, because these are crimes against all of us, against the humanity, period, and they should not carry different descriptions or different names based on the identity of the member. I know that many law enforcement agencies and many police departments and even many media outlets started to recognize this and not be shy to call it domestic terrorism. The same way we condemn international terrorism anywhere, at any part of the world, it's equally so in America, in Canada, in any place that we as a human have the precious right to live in safety and peace. That's why we chose a student for you today to start this discussion, followed by our distinguished guest speaker, which our Chief Ronald Haddad of Dearborn Police Department will introduce eventually. And we asked a student who is 18 years of age. He's a senior student at Wayne State University, despite his young age. You will be graduating as a BA and a master's degree together. And without even discussing with them anything related to this topic, we told them we want the mind of the young and the youth, how they think about it. So it's with a great deal of a pleasure I introduce to you the student Kashar Speti Kashkush to address you about this matter.
Good evening, everyone. If I mess up, let's blame it on the sound system and not me. It's an honor to be here among you guys tonight and to have the opportunity to speak with you guys. I'm here tonight to share my perspective on the mass killings which have been plaguing our country as of late. In the United States, a mass killing is defined as an incident with one or two perpetrators in which 3 or more people are killed. There's, on average, one mass killing every single day in our country. These killings don't have one defining trait. There is no one weapon which is used. The killers don't belong to one race, nor do they belong to a single social class. Some of them are mentally ill, whereas others seem completely normal until they commit their horrific acts. As an 18-year-old living in the United States, it shames me to admit that I've become accustomed to these killings. Innocent lives being stolen have become nothing but another number on the screen. Children and families being destroyed have become nothing but another source of debate on gun control and legislation. The victims of the killings are quickly forgotten, whereas the perpetrators live on in infamy and are dissected and discussed in detail, from their race to their childhood to their background. The cold-blooded humans who commit these killings have managed to take our humanity and make us just as calculated as they are. Now, I know that regardless of where you stand politically, you don't want innocent children to be murdered, and you don't want masses of people to be massacred. This common ground that we all share is called humanity. The issue of mass killings isn't a battle of liberals and conservatives, but rather it is a battle between good, humane people and evil, inhumane people. Humanity is what bonds us to and allows us to sympathize with our brothers and sisters around the world. If there is one thing that these mass killers have in common, it is that they lack humanity. No one with compassion could bring themselves to hurt so many innocent people. These killers have twisted mentalities about the world that they live in, and their hearts are filled with resentment and discontentment. Renowned physicist Marie Curie once said, "You cannot hope to build a better world without improving the individuals." To that end, each of us must work for his own improvement, and at the same time share a general responsibility for all humanity. I very much appreciate this quote, because while it still stresses self-improvement, it speaks towards a responsibility for those around us. We must work to stop these mass killings on the front line and at the point of first contact. Parents who are seen as role models by their children must lead by example and teach their children the value of benevolence and allegiance. Teachers who mold our future generations and spend most of their formative years with them must work to imbue a sense of humanity and patriotism within them. As a Canadian living in the United States, I've noticed that there isn't much patriotism among non-white Americans. America is a true global melting pot. An American can be black, white, Jewish, Muslim, old, young, but at the end of the day, they're still an American. This country has provided us all with many opportunities, and I love it for that. America isn't just a first world country ripe with resources. It is our home. The sooner that people begin to view America truly as our home and to love it as such, the better off we will be. Now, I know that we're all good, humane people, but it's time that we stop talking and tweeting and we start showing. One thing I noticed now that I'm in college and I'm almost an adult is I have way more power than I thought. My interactions with others, be they children or adults, impact them and shape their mentalities about the world. Each of these interactions is an opportunity, and we can leave the person better or worse off than we found them. We mustn't just preach our values of benevolence and sympathy, but also illustrate them through our actions. Maybe if one of the killers was shown an act of love or humanity, they wouldn't have gone through with their devastating deed. To my fellow young Americans, take advantage of your right to vote and use it to support someone who you want. Don't just align yourself with a party or blindly choose candidates based on their race or gender. Rather, support those who want the best for our country and those who will work to progress it. After so many decades of killings, it feels like we've fallen into a rut. A killing happens, some express their sympathy on social media, and the rest engage in a fiery debate about legislation and who is at fault. In order to escape this rut, we must be proactive as individuals and not sit around waiting for others to solve our problems. This proactivity can be characterized in many ways, from voting to educating others to being a good person to, as mentioned earlier, if you see something suspicious, report it to the FBI. If every human being who is benevolent on the inside were to actually exemplify their benevolence and to better those around them, we would be living in a better world. Now, I'm not only up here to be a critic and complain. Although mass killings are still a large issue, we have made some strides as a society. Police education programs have helped to teach those at schools and other places how to react to an active shooter situation. Legislators on both sides have worked to improve the state of affairs through things like more strict background checks and mental health reform. Mass killings aren't an issue which we can solve with a single law, nor can we write them off as simple givens within our society. We can only hope that as time goes on, we can become a more solidaric, patriotic populace. Now lastly, I'd like to thank Mr. Hamad and the AHRC for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I work with many community organizations throughout my youth, but the AHRC is one that has stuck with me the most. Human rights refer to things that every basic human needs and deserves. Things such as your right to live in freedom and safety, and to have food, water, and shelter. Your right not to be tortured. It's hard to even imagine life without these basic things, but every day millions go without them. I hope that with the advocacy of myself and of strong people like you, we can work to build towards a better world where everyone has their basic human rights, and towards the best America possible. Thank
you. Without further ado, our modern chief of police, Ronald Haddad of Dearborn Police Department.
this Bashar just say that he's almost an adult. I'm really shocked to see it. Last time I saw him, he was an eloquent speaker, but he's only about 6 years old, so he's really made some moves here. I'm really proud of you. He was a genius back then, and he's a genius tonight. That's somebody to watch there. Let's give him a hand. I had a 2-page introduction for the general here, but now I see it's in a nice colored brochure, so I'm just going to give you a couple of my thoughts about General Mike McDaniel. Brigadier General McDaniel was appointed as Michigan's first Homeland Security Advisor in 2003 while serving as Adjunct General for Homeland Security in the Michigan National Guard. This man has never worn one hat alone. He wears many. I see we have something in common here. I was named the first Homeland Security for the city of Detroit. I didn't even know how to spell Homeland Security. I did patrol all my life. First guy I called was General McDaniel. Whether it was him explaining what presidential directive number 7 or 8 meant, what is the stuff about interoperability, how do we get to the national stockpile, can we keep the tunnel and bridge open at all costs. He was always patient, and he made us a model Homeland Security for the city of Detroit. I can tell you that Super Bowl, you were right there with us, General. We had many trainings, and FEMA named Detroit as one of the best in the country, A+, and you had a big hand in that. I remember when we first trained the intel community, we had 400 of the most hard-nosed intel officers in Michigan at Solidarity House. The White House was nervous, don't do it. The governor was a little nervous, but she said, okay. We put on training that turned out to be a national model for that intel community. And Imad Hamad was one of the panelists that nobody wanted there that day. But we showed them that dialogue is the way to start this conversation. And that was like about 2 months after 9/11. So that took a lot of courage and a lot of work. I can also tell you that the general was a lawyer, constitutional lawyer to be exact. And let's fast forward. When I was named Chief of Police at Dearborn, I called him again. And he quickly set us up with Undersecretary Juliet Cayenne. We had a meeting. He was the leadoff hitter. I did the tail end of it and brought it home. And it just dawned on me, I got put on 5 national committees because of that. It caused me a lot of work. But when you talked about the United States sports leagues and making them come free, they said you'll never do it. I can tell you that every sports league in every stadium in America is gun free today. And we did that very quietly there. And these programs had to have national consensus after we set them up. And he never told us about the political pitfalls. He told us about the law. We wasted no time on that. And then we had a national recognized intervention model for mental health. And we caught really holy hell, right, General? Everybody was after us for it because we were out to violate everybody's rights. And it turns out now that after Harvard and all the way up to USC looked at it, it's a national model for intervention. You don't sit around and wait for a crime to be committed. But again, we didn't have guys like General McDaniel on our team, we would not have been so successful. I can tell you that it's a privilege that I call him a friend. He's had many accolades, and you can read the awards, but I'm very happy that he was given the Distinguished Patriot Award by Mayor O'Reilly that was made in the mayor's father's name, Mayor John O'Reilly Sr. So, come on up, General. I'm so proud that you're a friend.
Thank you, Chief. Imad Ahmad. Imad Ahmad is a force of nature. I knew him first back in very early days and stayed in contact with him ever since. Sometimes from a distance, but I always knew he was there. He is a conscience for all of us. Mayor O'Reilly, thank you so much for your service. It's been an honor to serve with you. Judges, other members of the community, distinguished guests, point of privilege, my old friend Mayor Burge Bernero of Lansing stopped by to hear me talk tonight. Appreciate that. So tonight, I don't want to talk specifically about terrorism because we've heard it. As Imad said, there are certain crimes against nature that have been recognized as international crimes. It's a small group. There's piracy, there's torture, there's human trafficking and slavery, and there's terrorism. What I want to talk to you about is the underlying issue, the issue which starts our dialogue here tonight and should continue our dialogue as we go forward in these trying times. I want to talk to you about the issue of civil rights and civility. Because civility, my friends, has left the building. It's AWOL, as we say in the military. It's gone. I'll give you two short examples, but they're two examples that really pained me. The first you may have seen, this is from Los Angeles. It was last December. There was a protest against Israel, or the U.S., the decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So there's a protest. Leaving that protest, caught on video, there's a young Palestinian-American girl. She's carrying a Dumb Trump sign that somebody had given her. She's 5 years old. And she was called a terrorist by another young girl from another family that wasn't Palestinian-American, obviously. And that so concerned me, because here we have two daughters of two different families, and the hate has gotten to the level that one young lady is calling this other young lady, at an age when they really cannot know better, a terrorist. The second, also from California, much more recently, a congressman in the Central Valley of California referred to his opponent as a terrorist. His opponent, the Democratic candidate running against him for U.S. Congress. He happens to have a Palestinian father. But if you look at this man, you should say to yourself, this is a great sign. Only in America can a Mexican woman, a Palestinian father, marry, and their son, at the young age of 29 years of age, having worked in the Obama White House, now run for Congress. This is a beautiful, good thing, an example of America, and yet what we see instead is it being used perhaps for political gain, but I hope it has the opposite effect. When civility leaves the building, as I said, what comes in place? It's divisiveness. It is this partisanship. Our public speech is lost. Let's think about that word civility. It seems to mean, on a superficial level, politeness, but it actually means so much more than that. Civility was the state of being a citizen. It is the need for good citizenship. And that idea of good citizenship, this condition of being a citizen then from earliest times, requires an involvement in public debate, in discussion, in discourse. That is what we need. And in this country, we're very, very blessed, my friends, because civility has been codified in the First Amendment. The First Amendment, you immediately think about speech and religion, but think of what else is in the First Amendment. The right to peacefully assemble, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, the right to freely exercise your speech. In a May 2010 commencement address at the University of Michigan, President Barack Obama identified incivility in public life as undermining the very possibility of compromise, democratic deliberation, and learning. As he says, why should we listen to a fascist or a socialist or a right-wing nut or a left-wing nut? It makes it nearly impossible, he concluded, for people who have legitimate but bridgeable differences to sit down at the same table and hash things out. I think the president was pointing out what we all know to be obvious, but we often overlook. We objectify the other. We give them labels. We create this otherness. And when we do that, we can ignore them, or even worse, we can vilify them or hate them. And labels such as communist, socialist have today become extremist or terrorist. So, saying the word extremist, let me sort of indulge in one side note if I can. I read with interest the articles in the Detroit Free Press recently about the program by the current administration called Countering Violent Extremism. I read them with interest because Chief Haddad and I were involved in that way back at the very beginning. And by the way, we were very uncomfortable with them calling it Countering Violent Extremists because it wasn't about extremists and it wasn't about countering extremists. Our vision of the program, shared I know by the Chief and Mayor O'Reilly, was a form of outreach to the community. It was the opposite of countering, and it was not directed at extremists. That wasn't the role of the program at all. This was a time when there's this big, huge, diverse agency called Homeland Security, which had just been set up in Washington, D.C., with pieces and sub-agencies across the nation. The governor had just appointed an advisor, me, for Homeland Security. The state police in the city of Detroit had set up departments called Homeland Security. What was this term? This was an opportunity for us to bridge that gap, to hold that dialogue. The intent was to build trust, to have a dialogue, to provide an explanation, to avoid labeling on any side. This name-calling, this labeling, the personal attacks in lieu of balanced, nuanced search for truth or even for compromise, as not just the California Congressman illustrates, but perhaps the Senate Judiciary Committee on both sides over the last 2 weeks shows that this virus, this illness, this cancer has reached a public and elected officials. Public discourse in the town square seems to be fading into history, but if that goes, so too does our democracy. The public square is a concept at the heart of American democracy. The metaphor refers to the idea of the heart of a small American town, that of previous generations perhaps, where all streets were lined with family-owned shops and civic institutions, leading to a grassy park, a square in the middle of a small town, which was centered on the four corners, or the four sides, by those necessary institutions, the courthouse, the schoolhouse, the library, the town hall. So it's both a metaphorical commitment to a First Amendment freedoms that I stated, and it's also a robust reflection of those virtual and real places where we have debates, public expressions, protests, and hopefully that dialogue. In settings now as diverse as street corners and shopping malls and town halls and barber shops and colleges, and even outside of abortion clinics and funeral services for soldiers, and on blog posts and podcasts, Americans from different walks of life are coming together to discuss, to debate, and even to protest. Protest is okay. The practices of democracy are often messy. Protesters may be loud and unruly. They are trying to display differing points of view. That's fine, but we have to avoid that lack of civility. So remember, especially at this time of year, that all those protections that I discussed that are in that First Amendment, that idea that we want you to speak freely, that we want you to debate and contradict your government, is all for a specific purpose. It's not just to vent our feelings and frustrations. Oh no, it is all to lead towards one goal, and that goal is to vote. To vote as a citizen. The most treasured, protected act within the Constitution, and the whole reason for the First Amendment is to protect political speech. Political speech so that we can act. It's the great duty of every citizen. So please, vote for or vote out your elected representatives. And the key, I believe, is that we cannot allow this incivility to overcome us. We have to reject the labels. We refuse to accept the labels of others. Dr. Martin Luther King was called an extremist. And he was called that by other Alabama clergymen. People did not understand him at the time. And in his writings in his letters from Birmingham jail, he said, if I must be an extremist, I am an extremist for love. He took that label and he turned it into something positive. I mentioned before, just in passing, about protests outside the funerals of soldiers. Even in the state of Michigan, we had the Westboro Baptist Church, which was the subject of that lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, that said that this church had the right to protest outside a military member's funeral. That was personally very painful when you see a young man, including from the Michigan National Guard when I was there, and I was at his funeral, and this happened more than once, and you would see these signs, and it says things such as God hates fags, and in some way, in some twisted mind, this is somehow related to some military action over in Asia. And what we had was this group called the Patriots Motorcycle Club, rather scruffy looking individuals on their motorcycles, but God bless them, they would stand with American flags between the individuals who were protesting at the funeral and the funeral itself. Passively, politely even protesting, just standing there at ease through the entire service. So you can protest and you can counter-protest, but we need to do that with this sense of civility. President Obama repeatedly described democracy as a conversation to be had, an ongoing, continuous conversation in which individuals test out their ideals, their vision, their values against the realities of common life. Sharper visions, deeper values should result. If that is the process, and then according to James Madison, brought about the Constitution itself, through a convention there in which he said no man felt himself obliged to retain his opinions any longer than that he was satisfied of their propriety and truth, and was open to the face of argument. Imad mentioned the idea of human-created disasters. For the last 2 years, until January of this year, I was involved in the city of Flint, and I was tasked by both the governor and the mayor separately to work to resolve the problems with the water system there. That's resolving the water system is actually sort of a simple engineering issue. Bringing both sides to the table is where I spent my time. Just as the chief said, we had to build consensus by bringing differing groups of people together in the early days of Homeland Security. So too, I endured a number of town halls and meetings where people were very frustrated and righteously angry at every level of government. And yet, there is a spirit of consensus and cooperation that we finally achieved. It takes a long time to do that, but it has to be done. There is no other way to do that without violence. And both sides. Whatever you think of either side, but the governor and the lieutenant governor were there until the very end, and so was the mayor, and we crafted a new solution, finding the funding to take care of this water solution. It took literally both sides sitting at that table, coming to a way to reach that solution. Today, as I said, the ability to vote is our most important civil act, but we still have varying political moments today involved with suppression of the vote, the continuation of political gerrymandering, to the intimidation of potential voters, exclusion and the silence of political participation that doesn't promote civility, far from it. It's easy to go after the sensibilities of other groups, whether liberal or conservative. It takes courage not to be seduced by those calls for violence. Unfortunately, that lack of civility itself has become weaponized. I am referring to the rise of hate crimes in the United States. We haven't yet received the FBI's annual hate crimes report for 2017. It should come out in the next month or so. It's usually in the fall. The one for 2016, though, counted 6,121 hate crime incidents in America, up about 5%. The greatest number of criminal actions, at 30%, were acts of intimidation. That is the concern. That is the concern. I had a law professor many years ago, and he said, when the law's on your side, you bang on the law. When the facts are on your side, you bang on the facts. And if you don't have the law or the facts on your side, you bang on the table. That's what I think this level of instability has become. It is worthless banging on the table. And yet, what we're really banging on is our opponents in this process. We're labeling our opponents rather than having this discourse with them. I think, and I would suggest to you, that that is where you get the concept of moral leadership, where you have, Mayor O'Reilly and I were just talking about this tonight beforehand, that compromise, that sense of collegiality that we once had seems to be gone, and we have to bring it back. 58% of the hate crimes Again, the number only went up about 4 or 5%, but 58% of those hate crimes were motivated by racial bias. Not surprisingly, more than half of them were targeted against Black Americans, followed by hate crimes targeting Latinos, which went up 15%, and hate crimes against Arabs, which went up 38% in this country. That's the concern. Fewer than half of our people, only about 39% of Americans believe that we still set a good moral example for the rest of the world. Where does the United States need to show moral leadership? Meetings like this, working with your congressman, changing by voting, changing by outreach, changing by discussion, changing by dialogue. Let me finish with a couple of thoughts here. First, that definition of moral leadership. I submit to you it is forever entwined with the concepts of tolerance and civility. Moral leadership is not simply a leader modeling ethical behavior. It is the recognition of that person in a leadership position that he's not there for his or her own sake, but for the sake of the people of the country they lead. A selfless leader leads by universal principles, those contained in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, when we recognize the equal and inalienable rights that each person, not just citizens, but each person, granted by the Creator. A leader who lives for the sake of others can cultivate empathy, compassion, and an expansive worldview. This enables him or her to understand and communicate alternative perspectives, creating pathways for innovation and development. So, if I was going to raise one issue, because I wrote down 3 or 4, but we haven't had our dinner yet, so I won't go to them. But if I was going to raise one, I would say this: we are currently in the middle of one of the worst, if not the worst, displacement crises in history worldwide. Worldwide, more than 68 million people have been forced from their homes. Of that, 25 million or more are refugees, of which half are children. Time like this, the world needs leadership from the United States, which over the years has led global efforts to resettle a small portion of the world's most at-risk refugees. The current administration, recently announced plans to lower the refugee admissions. The target for next year is 30,000, down from 45,000 this year. Because of other issues, we aren't even going to reach 45,000 admittees this year. We're on track to reach about 20,000. Less than half to go for the fiscal year, which is ending fairly soon, which ended. So, the Secretary of State, others will tell you that it's a matter of national security. You know, I can tell you that there is no group that has a more closely vetted or investigated than those who will be refugees. And yet, that is grinding refugee resettlement to a standstill. I would suggest that we need to push our congressmen, push the administration to raise the yearly target to 75,000. It's a modest number, but it would be a meaningful commitment. You got to press for that. The stakes are too high for Congress simply to acquiesce at such a low number as 30,000. I would also note from the statistics that I saw that Americans are also opposed to passing a law that would prevent refugees from coming to the U.S. They are in sync with this idea that we need to have more refugees. Only 1 in 3 Americans say they favor such a policy. 59% are opposed. I was going to talk at greater length about this. I would also point out that the U.S. we, the public, are totally opposed to the notion of self-deportation and don't believe that that is the way to solve the country's illegal immigration. Instead, I will close and I will suggest to you, how do we contribute? How do we assure that there is a positive discourse? How do we empower this generation, Bashara and others like him? How do we swing the pendulum back? How do we say, not only is it mass killings, but it is this lack of civility. That must be a thing of the past, that is not who we are, even though that is what they may have grown up with over the last generation. I think the answer comes from looking at our history and reminding ourselves of who we are. We are people who hold the tradition of spirituality, of hospitality, of education, innovation, industry. We supported ourselves and each other in a quest for advancement in social and economic equality. In the same manner, we must continue to support initiatives to restore civility in for the civil rights movement. Now, I do not know, nor do I need to know, when I ask you to look back at your history and who we are as a people, how you labeled yourself, because the labels are not important. You may have thought of yourself as your history, you might have said as an African American, a Lebanese American, a white American. It doesn't matter. I only ask that the word American be included, as those are our values. Our vision should be of an American where no other label is needed or wanted. If one were to label me, you would look at me and say, now there's a WASP and a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, if ever there was one. But my immediate family tree includes blacks, Asians, gays, and Muslims. The immediate family tree. And what I say is you cannot label somebody by their appearance, or it's only their actions and their words that count. This country has never been homogenous. We celebrate our diversity. We have built our nation, this large, awkward, noisy community. We built this family on the strengths of all the clans and tribes of the world. All are not only welcome, all are necessary. It is from our diverse roots that this tree has its strength. To continue to grow, we must again be welcoming of all and all points of view. The Constitution requires it. Our survival demands it. God bless you. God bless the United States.
I promise that we're going to serve dinner on time if the next speaker helps us to stick to the time. But before I proceed, I cannot help but to refer to when we talk about the human rights, when you talk about health, education, water, we see them as human rights, not a privilege or a luxury to those who can afford it. That's why human rights are God-made rights, not the human-made rights. This is why yesterday in Detroit, I know many of our clergy and imams from our community, Imam Turk, Imam Ilahi, and others, led a prayer and a press conference yesterday in Detroit against what I see and what the human rights community see, and call immoral, shut off of the services, of the water services, and thousands of people in Detroit simply because they cannot afford to pay for it. That's very sad. Not in America. It should not be in America. Second, when we talk about our criminal justice, I know that we all take pride of our judicial system, and we have high regard for our courts and judges. But like anything in life, nothing is perfect and nothing is free of the challenges. I know our Chief Judge, Denise Berichot, was with us here on couldn't stay, but she was here on behalf of the common values that we all stand for. Humanity comes first, equality, social justice, equal rights. Now, in reference to this, recently I read in the Legal News of Detroit and many other legal newspapers about a case, very inspiring, about a law student, a volunteer, part of the Michigan Innocent Clinic, who worked on a case of a gentleman of Yemeni origin who was convicted for a double homicide murder and was in jail for 16 years. This law student who recently graduated as a lawyer, she's yet to apply for the bar, with her team, managed to invest long hours, managed to provide a motion that compelled the Wayne County Circuit Court to reopen the case to free the man on bond pending his full innocence. And that's what we call wrongful conviction, that unfortunately frequently happen within our criminal justice system. I want you all to salute that student, Husna Khan, who's here with her team. I want her to stand up with the team to salute you for the great job. Husna is there. Can you come up here? That's the lady with no pay, as a student, as a group of students, who did this miracle for this gentleman who spent 16 years on wrongful conviction and jail. So that's for all of us to be proud.
I wanted to thank Mr. Imad Hamad for inviting me here today. The topic of wrongful conviction is something that I've been thinking about even before law school. If you haven't watched CNN Death Row Stories, I would suggest watching it. I watched an episode in 2014 that not only changed my life, but it changed the man whose life I helped, the man who I helped free. And he was up for parole in 2045. So his case had been stagnant for many years before I came along. And there was something about his case, there was so much corruption there, that it really inspired me to work hard. And now he's been able to reunite with his family. So, talking about human rights abuses and injustice in the world, that's one of the most gravest abuses in our criminal justice system, where innocent people are being convicted every single day due to a multitude of factors. It's not just one factor, it's many factors. And I was just a law school intern. And the case that I saw, it was the Edward Lee Elmore case, so you can go on YouTube. A law school intern was introduced to that case. She took the bar, passed it, and she helped free Edward Lee Elmore. And I sent her an email the other day saying thank you to her for inspiring me. Because if it hadn't been for Diana Holt, I wouldn't have done the work on the case that I worked on. So thank you so much, Mr. Imad Hamad, for being an advocate for human rights and for inviting me here today. It means so much to me. Thank you.
Again, when we talk about safety and security, we talk about common responsibility as government and people. So, without further ado, I introduce our U.S. Attorney here of the Eastern District of Michigan, who is as well committed for the social justice that we talk about.
Where's Bashar? Your speech was so good, but I think you made one mistake. I believe you said you were almost an adult. You, sir, are an adult. You are more adult than many people in this world, so thank you for your remarks. And thank you to AHRC. So what does the United States Attorney do? I, as United States Attorney, my colleague Simon Mosen, First Assistant United States Attorney, our job is to prosecute cases and to follow the Constitution and the laws of the United States. When the FBI brings us a case, or local law enforcement brings us a case, we stand up in the courtroom and we say, may it please the court, my name is Matthew Schneider and I represent the United States of America. And we bring criminals to justice. We fight violent crimes, but that's not all we do. We protect civil rights, and we're going to do that each and every day in our office. That's exactly why we're here. You might remember there was an incident in Charlottesville where there was a violent, extreme group of people, a white supremacist group, and there was another group of people who were protesting them. One of the violent white supremacists got in his car. He identified where the group was protesting, the peaceful protesters. And what did he do? He backed up a hill and he aimed his car at the protesters, the counter-protesters. And he took his time. And he revved up his engine. And he made a decision. And he drove his car into that crowd of people. And we all saw that on TV. I'm very proud to tell you that the Justice Department has charged him with federal civil rights crimes and hate crimes, because that's what it was, a hate crime. And we are standing up for the victims in that case. In conclusion, I don't know what our biggest challenge is, whether it's violent crime. I have a feeling, though, I think our biggest challenge might be not talking together. I noticed something standing behind me right here. It says, breaking barriers, building a future. My friends, we cannot fight against violence unless we are all together, breaking barriers, meeting and talking together. Can you say this with me? Breaking barriers, building a future. The United States Justice Department wants to work with you to build a future and to break barriers. We can only do that if we have good, continuous, constant dialogue. And we definitely want to be your partner in that. Thank you very much.
It's a blessing when you have a good U.S. attorney around. Thank you, Mr. Schneider. You know, every time we go upon him, he's been there. Next, we move forward with the program with our Canadian law enforcement, with the OPP from Canada. The reason that they are here with us, as we said, this challenge is not a local challenge. It's an international challenge, local, national, and international. So without further ado, this is Sergeant, Staff Sergeant Brad Poole from OPP.
Ahmad, Chief of DAD, Mr. Mayor, distinguished guests, bring greetings and well wishes from Inspector Glenn Miller, Detachment Commander of the Ontario Provincial Police, Essex County Detachment, who could not be here tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to engage in this important dialogue this evening and help bring focus and relevant conversation to the issues of hate, violence, and terrorism. Acts of terrorism, mass attacks, and incidents of hate should continue to shock us all. But unfortunately, because of the rate of instances, our response becomes somewhat muted. We quickly investigate and we brace ourselves for reoccurrence. We hope each day that the pendulum of violent acts will recede. However, we must remember that the history has shown that there is an element of society that will continue to prey upon the innocent in an effort to diminish those freedoms we enjoy and at times perhaps take for granted. Canada is not immune from the threat of terrorism, hate crime, or violent criminal acts. Despite the collaborative efforts undertaken by our intelligence, law enforcement, and valued entities such as the AHRC. You will remember in Canada, in our capital city of Ottawa in 2014, a Canadian soldier who was on ceremonial sentry duty at the Canadian National War Memorial was assassinated by a lone gunman, and then who gained access into our Parliament buildings where members of Parliament and our Prime Ministers were meeting. He engaged in a gun battle with security forces and was killed. While some may not be familiar, but certainly widely remembered by Canadians, is the 1989 massacre at the Montreal École Polytechnique, where 28 students were shot and 14 female engineering students were killed. In April of this year, in a popular area of downtown Toronto, a man drove a van along a street and sidewalk, killing 10 people and injuring 13. Our greatest threat, aside from the natural disasters, will remain with individuals indoctrinated and radicalized into violent ideologies of various beliefs. The belief by some individuals that instilling death and fear in our citizens is necessary in support of their personal beliefs is certainly misguided. The escalation of violence in its various forms regrettably have changed the way we live, but certainly not diminished our collective resolve to continue to enjoy the amazing opportunities we all share. The actual number of hate crimes reported to police in Canada unfortunately does not reflect the accuracy of these crimes, as some of the demographic groups are not so willing to report these incidents to police. Nearly half of all hate crimes reported in Canada were targeted victims and based on race and religion. While it's unrealistic in our society, at least at this time, to expect that extreme violence will diminish, it's realistic to believe that through our ongoing positive partnerships in the pursuit of respectful relationships, honoring respect for cultural diversity, we can demonstrate that expressions of one's belief can be delivered without the consequences of violence. As a career-long police officer, and being in the company of community-focused people such as yourself, I continue to feel invigorated by what has been accomplished. But with your support and the friendship we share across our borders, we can make a difference and help to ensure a safe and secure community for both our countries. Again, I wish to extend my appreciation to all of you, Iman, and on behalf of Inspector Glenn Miller, I look forward to meeting each of you throughout this evening. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, we wish Inspector Miller a speedy recovery who couldn't be with us tonight. And with the final guest presentation, Imam Ahmed Saleh, Dr. Ahmed Saleh. He's the founder of the Islamic Studies and UD Mercy and Oakland University.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Sat Sri Akal. Peace and Pax. Good evening. Those who love only themselves, me, mine syndrome, are narcissists. Those who love only their family are nepotists. Those who love only their friends are cronies. Those who love only people from their own city or locality are provincialists. Those who love only the rich and powerful are elitists. Sectarian nationalists only root for their country and their own nation. And the religious bigots are those who support and anchor only people from their own denomination, their own mother, or their own religion. We must embrace inclusive excellence. We must embrace the humanity of every child and daughter of Adam and Eve. One of the noblest objectives of the Islamic law is hifdul irq, which means protection of dignity, and tahsinul irq, which means enhancement of that dignity, human dignity. Your blood, your honor, your property are inviolable, the Prophet said, and all these are all sacred. There are phrases of Moses, of Muhammad and Omar in the US Supreme Court. And in the Library of Congress, if you look up to the ceiling, you see Islam as one of the great contributors to civilizations, Greeks and Romans, but Islam is mentioned, the only religion there. Researchers now credit Islam and Ottoman law for the huge influence on the US Constitution. If you see Jefferson's Quran, you'll find 151 pages on Islamic law. And he really made very generous notes around there. In fact, some are tracing English common law back to Norman Sicily and back to North Africa, where the Muslims had Ottoman rule. Now, the separation of state and religion also comes from Islamic tradition. And it's a very, very imprecise mantra that religion and state were never separate in Islam. We have siyasa, we have sharia, we have place for different tribal codes. All were under the umbrella of empire law. Islam can inform and reform many parts of the brokenness within the American justice system. Islam recognizes victim opinion evidence and victim impact evidence. There's a case of gentleman Mark Stroman. 3 days after 9/11, he went out to shoot Arabs. The first gas station he comes to, he kills a Hindu. The second gas station he comes to, he kills a Pakistani Muslim. The third gas station, he almost kills a Bangladeshi. Rais Bhuiyan then went out to get many Muslim activists, Muslim pro bono lawyers, to fight for the release of this KKK gentleman who's the murderer. Even after 10 years, Texan law would not allow victim opinion evidence or victim impact evidence. And then the lawyer defending Mark, the KKK gentleman, said, why is it that Sharia law and Islamic law is more humane and more kind to murderers than even Texan law? So there's so much that we could learn from going back to Islamic history. 1625, Hugo Grotius, who's known as the father of international law, wrote his book. It is now found that verbatim he stole the words of a gentleman who wrote 700 years before him, Al-Shatibi, one of the greatest Arab thinkers. Jefferson's Quran also suggests that President Jefferson generally borrowed and at times even applied Sharia law. He had a case with an Anglican couple, Kitty Eunice and her husband, Dr. James, who was a bit insane and impotent. And he couldn't find any solution to that. He went and searched for 9 different legal systems and found the Muslim Ottoman system to be the best to apply. Sharia law has been applied in the US since the time of Jefferson, and very few people know that. But in Islam, justice is about the pursuit of innocence and the innocent. Justice is about a jury that loves innocence and the innocent. And we cannot have a prison industry that is really profiting from the misery of vast majority of innocent people from minorities that are being incarcerated. The Blackstone formulation states, and this is from the United States, that it is better to release 10 criminals in order not to harm a single innocent person. It's better to release 10 criminals in order not to harm a single innocent person. At the farewell sermon, the Prophet, peace be with him, denounced white privilege, he denounced Arab privilege, and even black privilege. So whether there's reverse racism, there's no place for that. At all times we must look at, if we look at the case of Kavanaugh right now, every case must be treated on its own merit. Whether you're white Caucasian, whether you are a black person, whether you're the woman who's the accuser, there must always be the presumption of innocence. And that is how we have to go into every particular case. Islam is colorblind. There is no place for racism. There's no place for patriarchy. There is no place for patriarchy. Medina society was very matriarchal. Women marched to the house of the Prophet demanding their rights. And the women went to war. Aisha went to battle. And many of them were the professors of great men. So the presumption of innocence is extremely important. Only 6 verses of the Quran speaks about the foundational pillar of Islam, which is the fasting. There are 8 verses mentioning the word Siyam, but 6 mention Siyam or Ramadan. 629 verses of the Quran mentions adl, qist, and speaks against dhulam. So justice and injustice. 1200 verses of the Quran deals with love, with forgiveness, with mercy. 1/3 of the entire Quran is about the intersection of mercy and justice. And if you want to be a true Muslim, and we love our fasting, and we should love our fasting, we should equally love justice and peace. Now, all of us, whether we go to the synagogue, or to the church, or to the temple, or to the Gurdwara, we need to embrace the cardinal virtues of humility, of charity, and truthfulness. Today, unfortunately, truth-telling has become a subversive obedience. truth-telling has become something that is almost dangerous. Fighting for peace is dangerous in a war economy and disaster capitalism. And so we really need to hold our moral standards, our Christian, our Jewish, our Muslim, our Sikh, our Hindu standards up high. There's no oppression Olympics. No one's pain is more than anyone else's pain. We are all human, we are all rainbow children, as Bishop Tutu says, and we are all the children of Adam. Justice should never be selective. Human rights should never be selective. Human dignity should never be selective. Let me, before we have a concluding remark, there are two words that we share in most of the gatherings we go to, and that is the name of Al-Masih, which is the name for Christ in Arabic, Messiah, Masih. Masaha, for those who know Arabic. And Masaha means to touch and to heal. Christ, peace be with him, had many lepers with leprosy in his society, and there was a ban on lepers to come with him, to stay within 30 cubits, to be away from non-lepers. A leper approached Jesus Christ, peace be with him, touched him, and Christ turned around, broke the ban, and actually touched the leper and healed the leper. Now, there's no one more disgusting than the look of a leper, and yet Christ, peace be with him, embraced the disgusting other. Today, often the disgusting other could be Hispanics, it could be Arab American, they could be African American, Native American. We need to embrace the disgusting other if we want to be Christ-like. If we look at the opposite word for Christ, Masih, the Antichrist in Arabic is Al-Masih. And those who know Arabic, there's a single dot differentiating Masih from Masih. But the Antichrist in Arabic means to distort, to conflate, and to deceive. If our politicians conflate and distort and deceive, they're Antichrist-like. If our clergy do that, they're Antichrist-like. If our academics do that, they're Antichrist-like. Let us not distort, let us not deceive, and let us not conflate, let us not be Antichrist-like. In the history of Democrats, many Democrats turned over to demagogues. Sometimes immediately and sometimes after a few decades. And so from Christ to Antichrist, a single dot, it's very quick. It's very easy to turn the American dream into an American nightmare. But American dream has become American nightmare for those kids that were put in cages. Everyone deserves dignity and everyone deserves human rights. Let me end off and say, I have my own definition of what it is to be a true American and what it is to be a true patriot. There are three patriots, two bad and one good. The two good bad patriots are the loveless critics and uncritical lovers. The only good patriot has a lover's quarrel with his nation, a lover's quarrel with his community. And so we need to be the only good patriot, and the most American thing is to have civil disobedience and to have some dissent. And so let us end off then and ask God to help us to be true Americans who turn tragedies into triumphs, hostilities into hospitalities, hurts into healing, bigotry and bullying into benevolence, bring peace where people are in pieces. Let us bring that extremism of love and radiant justice, a great care about innocence, a revolution of values. And even a true definition of Sharia. Sharia is multiple ways, salient ways of being human and being humane. Just to end off then, Arabic saying, نعيب زماننا والعيب فينا وليس لزماننا عيب سوانا وليس الذئب يأكل لحم ذئب ويأكل بعضنا بعضا عيانا. God bless us all. America is only going to be beautiful, Canada is only going to be beautiful if Americans are beautiful. كن جميلا ترى الوجود جميلا.
We're not going to have you wait longer. We will be proceeding with the program. Now with the state drug elect attorney Isaac Robinson. who served also as an AHRC Secretary of the Board.
Make some noise for Muhammad. Make some noise if you're hungry. They think you left the homicide here earlier. We've been real mad. But I want to bring in some of the leaders of, my name is Isaac Robinson, by the way. I want to bring up our illustrious President, Dr. Musla. Come on up. You're about to get presented with an award. When Ahmad said final presentation, it was like 3 more. It's like one more picture, one more picture, one more picture. Let's holla, State, please join us. Minnie Washington, our Vice Chairman, Naveed Ashraf.
Hello, sir. How are you? This is my son.
For a special presentation, we would like to bring up His Excellency Fernando Gonzalez Saife, Consul General of Mexico, Michigan. Give him a round of applause.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Fernando Gonzalez, Consul of Mexico. Today it's my pleasure to give a proclamation, a very well-written proclamation to the American Human Rights Council.
Excuse me. Enjoy the meal, but please give a chance to the Consul General to speak.
All right, everybody, I know it sounds crazy, but everybody just stop what you're doing. We're going to have a quick presentation. All right, stop that, kick, all that. All right, give it up for His Excellency.
Thank you so much. Just briefly, I want to say that I met Hamas a year ago when I arrived as Consul General of Mexico to Detroit. And since we spoke, we had one aim, and it's uniting our communities. It's working together. It's identifying when there's an issue that hurts all communities. I commend the man for taking part when the issue of separation of children. Right. And I commend this association for speaking hard in local issues and universal issues. And something really remarkable happened just a month ago when the American Human Rights Council received the affiliated NGO status within the United Nations. What does this mean? That the organization, the American Human Rights Council, will be speaking in ECOSOC at the United Nations on all issues pertaining to human rights, elevating the voice from the local to the universal. In that regard, today, the Consulate of Mexico in Detroit gives this proclamation and this award to the American Human Rights Council in recognition of your outstanding contributions to the defense of human rights, promotion of a culture of respect for human rights, and your attaining affiliated NGO status within the United Nations. Congratulations.
We have actually 2 more presentations. And just on the says closing remarks, I'm not going to give no closing remarks. Y'all have heard his great speech.
Salto. Şöyle kullu.
All right, we have two honorees. Our next honoree probably has over 100 tributes, but he's one of the most impactful local police chiefs in the history of our nation. And he probably, well, I've had a chance to hear some of his presentations, but he's been called on to testify in Washington by the Department of Justice and other governmental agencies because of his leadership dealing with different situations here in the great city of Dearborn. The American Human Rights Council has two honorees today, and our first honoree from the east side of Detroit, Chief Ronald Haddad, who's now our legendary police chief, recognized across the nation. And a shout out to Ebony T from All Pro Color for this beautiful tribute. The American Human Rights Council, there's something in Arabic and in Spanish, I can't read that, but I think it's the American Human Rights Council. Exemplary Leadership Award, proudly presented to Chief Ronald Haddad, the Dearborn Police Department. They give it up for all the law enforcement in the room. We got Kent in the house, Benny Napoleon here. We got UPD over here, Kelsey, Bartell, for being a model law enforcement agency and partnering with communities, building trust and mutual respect through education, training, and public awareness activities. With all those horrible videos we see across the nation, where young men are being shot down in a bad situation, isn't it a blessing to have a police chief who works with the community, get things done, and be fair to our community? Give it up for Chief Haddad. I'm producing this here. So in the program, I'm going to skip Reggie Reg Davis for a second. Not to skip you, but we're going to put you, I really want you to come up because they're doing some audio and visual. So hopefully when he comes up, you'll have less all that chattering and smacking and all the things that are going on. In my time, well, Kathy M. Garrett is in the room. I just want to say Kathy M. Garrett's in the room, County Clerk. Please stand up, Kathy M. Garrett. The election is November 6th, by the way. We're not telling you how to vote, but I know Kathy M. Garrett wants you to get out the vote. Express yourself. Got some advice? So I was going to have the Apollo about to get pulled off. I've had the opportunity to work for Congressman Conyers. Law school, I worked with Reverend Jackson. A lot of times we don't recognize what we have before us. And Ahmad Hamad is one of the most prominent civil rights leaders of our time. And to pull law enforcement together, the faith community, he's an amazing man. He's an amazing man. He started bridges after 9/11. After U.S. Senator Carl Levin connected him and U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Collins. Groundbreaking work, bringing law enforcement and the community together. And so we're about to do a special presentation, but I want to bring up some dignitaries just to stand here because American Human Rights Council is doing some historic stuff. A civil rights leader now connecting us all to human rights. And he deserves another round of applause. Ahmad. We have in our midst the only pastor in Michigan who's also a judge, the one and only Judge Donald Coleman, 36th District Court. He's running for re-election. Please join us, Judge Coleman. We have the man that should have been governor. There wouldn't have been no Flint crisis if Verge Bonero, the former mayor, was governor. Please come up with Verge Bonero. Confidant of Rosa Parks, Elaine Steele here. Please join us, Elaine Steele. George Duraney, our clerk, please join us. Sam Baydoun, County Commissioner. Ali Bali, founder of Access. All of our elected officials from the city of Dearborn, please join us, if you will. Chief Haddad, my brothers from Detroit, DPD, Sergeant Kelsey and Officer Bartell, please join us. Our imams, please join us if you can. Now, Dr. Ned Fawaz, who was a Barack Obama appointee, my lawyer from Kentucky in the prosecutor's office, who do you want to bring up? Oh, I already know Judge Archer's in the house. I ain't gonna get in trouble. Council President Jones, thanks for getting on one. Oh, we know Jewel Jones in the house. I thought he left too, but State Rep Jewel Jones, please join us in a minute after you get a couple more of that good hum. Judge Robbie Archer, please join us. From 36th District Court, the one and only Roberta Archer, she's also on the ballot. From the city of Westland, Tasha Green. If you're an elected official or a candidate, we have Suzette Samuels running circuit court. John Cahalan was here earlier. Suzette, are you still here? Come on, Suzette. And Suzette created, we have Captain Jay himself on the sprinkle some lemon pepper on the stage. Give it up for lemon pepper. Now, if you feel like you're really important, you just want to crash the picture, come on, I don't care. But if the thing falls, you were invited, you weren't disrespected. You were invited. Judge Davis, State Rep Lake Winstead. Karen, everybody? Or this is Karen Winstead. We're going to be up in Lansing together. We're going to turn around. Anything Snyder did bad, we're going to get rid of it. Judge Perry's in the house. I don't know. Oh, that's Barry, the legendary that's Barry. I've seen her at 10 wind up them tickets. Come on up.
Just a little bit.
All right, I think we're at capacity. We have to have Sam Alonso here from YPAC, but he might have left. No, he's here. My brother Masood, you don't got to come up, but I love you. Brother Masood Alawamza, you went to college together. We got London Bell, who worked a lot on making the American Rights Council, the great organization. London Bell, please stand up. Attorney London Bell, I don't know if she's still here.
We have everyone?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. Put your mic down.
I did invite El Turk to come up, and he's being shy.
I'm sorry.
At least I'm not interrupting your dinner with this. I didn't say stop eating.
Okay, this side's going to have to come in a little bit. You're crowding in a lot of people.
All right, but what's, I want to bring up we have two presenters. I want to bring up William Reveley. William Reveley, everybody listen to me. In 1965, he was the president of the SCLC, working with Dr. King. Close friend of Dr. King was here. Give it up for Reverend William Reveley.
Hey, said everyone?
The one and only Imam Alahi. Now he opens up his mosque to the community. Great leader. But we need to let William Reveley come up. Please let the presenter come around. The man in the red jacket. I want him up here with me. But what's happening today is a connection, the spirit of Rosa Parks, the spirit of Dr. King, the civil rights movement, connecting it up with the struggle for human rights worldwide. Ernest Culberson is here. We got down with the Michigan NAACP back there. If you could please approach and be part of our picture, Ernest Culberson. Before I hand the mic to Reverend Reveley, I want to hand it up to Mayor Bergevin to say good morning.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Our committee said, give me a place to stand and I will move the world. I do believe Imad is moving the world right here from the center of the universe, Dearborn, Michigan. Keep up the great work and congratulations. Honored to be here.
Give it up for Bergevin, potential governor. Oh, Chief, I'm not trying to block you. You ain't gonna lock me up. And you got the pass though, and the judge, and GPD. I better have it.
Are we ready, Isaac?
For a picture?
Yes. Let's take a picture. Put your mic down.
We're about to do the presentation.
Put your mic down. There we go. See if I can see everyone. Everyone on me, please. Hold that thought.
All right, the main thing now is we want to celebrate this man and this organization, the American Human Rights Council. I don't know if LaPangie Thomas is recording this. We have here a young political power activist who has a podcast. But this organization now has official status with the United Nations, which means if we raise enough money, we can all go to Geneva every week. We give them to Reverend.
My leader here, Dearborn, Detroit Association of Black Organizations, presents the Harsh L. Sheffield Jr. Exceptional Recognition Award to the one and only Ahmad. Recognition for his outstanding contributions to the defense of human rights. Given status that few have attained over the years, being recognized as part of the United Nations, and all it takes is money to be able to go where folks have failed to trade. They can't go because you don't have invitation to come, but you got invitation, you just need some money. All right, all right. So we're going to do better. All the speakers have told us how badly we need to be working together. And it is my hope and desire that as we work together, we can make things happen in our nation. I was asked the other day who I was most impressed with as a leader of men. And I told them that the person that I lifted was the one and only Sun Myung Moon. And they said, Sun Myung Moon? Why would you call him? You worked with Dr. King, you've been with all the civil rights leaders, and you talk about Sun Myung Moon. Yes. Why? Because Sun Myung Moon was a man who was determined to bring Christians together. His organization was to unify Christianity, not to make anybody special over anybody else. He said, for his people not to form another church, but to join the existing churches and spread the good news, so that we would be united with all people. And so I learned so much from him as he made the way for me to travel across the world. It started me to know that we got to meet folks to find how valuable they are. Don't talk so much about my being a Christian. I went to visit some folks over in Cambodia. They were Buddhist priests. And I said to them, will you tell me, it's rainy season, not much rain outside, not too much water. What do you do when it doesn't rain? He said, Reverend, we pray. I said, okay, so what happens when it doesn't rain after you pray? He said, we just pray some more. I said, well, what happens after that? He said, we pray some more. I said, so what are we waiting on now? Are we praying or what are we doing? He said, we're waiting for the prayers to be answered. And that's what we are waiting for, the prayers to be answered as we come together in these United States and in this state of Michigan, and all of us together in this room. We have to learn to come together and follow the leadership. So who is the leader? I give you your leader here. Ahmad.
All right, we're really down to the last presentation for real, for real. Give it up for Judge Donald Coleman. He's on the ballot. Judge Donald Coleman. We have Robbie Archer, Judge Robbie Archer. She's a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Anybody ever heard of that? Make some noise if you heard of the Deltas. All right. Again, Judge Khalil Davis is in the house, 36 District Court, my good friend. Our last honoree is a very special Detroit icon. But when I was a little boy, listening to the radio, me and Ernest would turn on the radio and hear the voice, not Ernie Harwell, we were in the Tiger game, but we would hear the legendary voice of Reggie Reg Davis. For over 3 decades, this voice of the people brought us connection to celebrities, a giving soul, but he also lost his brother to gun violence. And this local celebrity started a nonprofit organization, Ceasefire Youth Initiative, working with our young people. We don't want our young people going to prison. We want them going to school, getting a job. And it's Reggie Reg Davis who's on the front lines of confronting real issues. Please give it up and make a round of applause for the one and only Wayne County Commissioner, former Detroit County Commissioner, legendary radio icon Reggie Reg Davis. And this award reads, and if Dr. Winslow, if you could join us and bring up Miss Minnie Washington again, please come up for this presentation. Brother Naveed Ashraf, Ms. Hala, please come up. The American Human Rights Council presents this Exemplary Leadership Award to the Honorable Reggie Reg Davis, who represents Brightmoor and part of the West Side on the Wayne County Commission. A radio icon, leader in government, an advocate for nonviolent conflict resolution, for his distinguished leadership of the Ceasefire Youth Initiative, lifetime devotion to curbing youth violence, and for promoting diversity, peace, and inclusion. Congratulations. As Ahmad reminds us, we are united, we stand against hate and terror. We also have his honorable assistant, Mr. Machete, Chief of Staff, and honorable assistant. I'm going to jump in. Again, make some noise for Reggie Reg Davis. Live, the Bank of 1989, WJLB.
First, I want to say thanks again to these great people. My brother Ahmad. Let's make some more noise for this brother right here, please, everybody. Assalamu alaikum, alhamdulillah. And Isaac Robinson, thank you to you and your mother, Rosemary Robinson, I served with on the Charter Commission. And you and your mother taught me everything, gave me a crash course from the radio to politics. Oops, I mean politics. Thank you. Make some noise for this brother right here, everybody, Isaac Robinson. And I'm not going to talk long because I did enough talking on the radio for 36 years. I'm a 36-year radio broadcast veteran, and it was a pleasure to entertain and inform you. And I also want you to, say a couple words. Machete Muhammad, my chief of staff. But I want to say this. Change is a word that we're all very familiar with. Change. It's inevitable. Everything, all things will change. Once upon a time, everybody, once upon a time, those that look like myself, we could not vote. We had to drink water from a specific water fountain. When we got on the bus, we could hardly ride in the front of the bus. We went to schools that were segregated. You know the story. That has all changed, everybody. Today, we have the youngest state rep in the state of Michigan. We have the first African-American councilperson in the city of Westland. Change is inevitable. But let me tell you, everybody, about the change that I am prepared to make, to be a part of. The type of change that I cannot wait to see. And that is, I hope that one day soon, I can turn on the morning newscast and not see 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 examples of senseless gun violence in the city of Detroit. I'll say it again. The change that myself, my team, the Ceasefire Youth Initiative are prepared to make is that one day we will turn on Fox 2, Channel 4, Channel 7 and not see senseless gun violence happening over and over again. I don't know if you all know it, but the city of Los Angeles, California has about 3.5 or 4.5, should I say, million people. Detroit has 700,000. Do you know, everybody, that last year, Detroit had more murders as a result of gun violence than the city of Los Angeles. Did you know that? And we are now, some say, back in the top spot of one of the most dangerous cities in this country. We got to change that. That is the change that I wish to see. That is the change that the Ceasefire Youth Initiative, in honor of my baby brother Vito Davis, is prepared to make. And before I go, because like I said, I don't want to talk long, did enough talking on the radio for 36 years, I am blessed to have my Muslim brother, and I also want to say that to everybody. Assalamu alaikum, alhamdulillah. My Muslim name is Bilal Naji, and my chief of staff is Machete Muhammad. And I'm very blessed to have this awesome team. We are Muslims. Islam is about peace. We are in the city of Detroit trying to change everything as a result of peace, as a result of Islam. So, Brother Machete Muhammad, you guys put your hands together and share a few words.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, and for those of you who may be just from the city of Detroit, what up, though? It is an honor to come before this body to receive an award for a passion that we do without looking for accolades. If you're serious about change, you don't need anyone to recognize you but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we don't do this because we're looking for rewards. We do this because it's our passion. We got to recognize that our children are our gifts. my grandfather was a Baptist preacher from Birmingham, Alabama, would always say, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift. That's why we call it the present. Our children are our gift, and we should take that into consideration and do what we need to do to make this world a better place for them once we leave on. So again, it's an honor, it's a pleasure and a privilege, and I greet you again in the greeting words of peace. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Brother Isaac, thank you.
Give it up one more time for the Chevy and Reggie Ray Davis. Your best for last, right, y'all? All right, enjoy your dinner. Judge Donald Coleman, can you come say a prayer for us or say hi? If you want votes in Southwest Detroit, this is the mayor of Southwest Detroit, Al Nasser. I met him at Tailwind, when they got that cow in a cage. What else did you have with him? Oh, okay. That's why, Joe, show me this picture. Mr. Chapman, can you get this picture of Al Nasser, the mayor of Southwest Detroit? Jump on up. Right here. Come on, Judge Barry. Now, Judge Barry, no one ever runs against her, but she's still out here. You gotta get her.